We're living in the era of sexual freedom, or at least that's the story we were told. Have sex whenever you want, with whoever you want, as much as you want, as long as there's consent. You're fine. That's become the new moral baseline, and many of us embraced it. We swiped, we experimented, we called it empowerment, but privately the results haven't always matched the promise. If you're a woman, you may have felt that tension most clearly. Moments that were technically consensual, but left you wondering why something still felt off. Consent was supposed to solve everything. But consent only answers one question. Was this allowed? It doesn't ask, was this wise? Was this safe? Was this actually good for me? And here's the uncomfortable possibility. What if the framework we were given was incomplete? What if freedom without a deeper ethic leaves people navigating something far more complicated than expected? And if there's anyone who stepped into that tension early, it's Louise Perry. She was one of the first feminists to publicly ask whether sexual revolution had made women happier, not from outside the movement, but from within it. Her book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, didn't just get attention. It became one of the most talked about texts of the decade, igniting international debate and forcing a serious reconsideration of what sexual liberation actually is. Because it said something many women were already thinking, but weren't sure they were allowed to say out loud. And that matters because modern life has changed in ways that make living well harder than it should be. It doesn't just shape what we do, it shapes what we want. And when desire itself is shaped by narratives we didn't choose, we drift into survival mode instead of living with conviction. And that's why Mighty Pursuit exists, to give you a North Star, integrating mind, body, and spirit into one clear roadmap for living well. And today we zoom in on sex, how culture shapes our desires, and what it actually takes to build a sex life that empowers you rather than quietly eats away at you. Nothing in this conversation is off limits. We talk about orgasms, we talk about hookup culture, we talk about the environments we've normalized, and the ones we've left behind in the past. Some of what Louise says may shock you, some of it may convict you, but if we're serious about living well in the coming age, this conversation is unavoidable. All right, before we jump into today's episode, we wanted to share an important update. For the past year, behind the scenes, we've been building something that we believe is foundational to everything we talk about here. It's called The Nine. The podcast is powerful, but it's episodic. It's one big idea at a time. Mental health, dating, sex, spirituality, whatever it might be. Each episode stays with a single theme long enough to actually understand it. But The Nine brings everything together. It keeps the 9 core areas of life across mind, body, and spirit in view at the same time. You've probably heard us allude to them each week. Now we're putting them into a rhythm you can actually live with. Every week, The Nine does 3 specific things for you. 1, it directs your attention to the parts of life that need care right now. 2, it offers one clear evidence-based insight drawn from science, history, spiritual wisdom, and real human experience. And 3, it suggests one grounded action you could take in each area to respond. In a world engineered to hijack your attention, The Nine becomes a line of defense, a way to pause, recenter, and keep what matters front and center. If you do that imperfectly but consistently, you begin to thrive. That's what The Nine is for. So you could sign up through the link in the description below or head to mightypursuit.com/the9. All right, now let's get back to today's episode. Louise, thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. Hi.
So before we discuss big picture ideas, I kind of want to begin on a human level. In your research and reporting, can you take us into a story of a woman who was quote unquote operating by today's cultural standards in regards to her sexuality and yet was experiencing some conflict on the inside?
So the story I begin my book with is Marilyn Monroe. Because I think probably more than anyone, she's the woman who really symbolizes the sexual revolution of the 60s. But I pair her story in that chapter with that of Hugh Hefner, who's the man who probably best symbolizes the sexual revolution of the 60s. Because there were some uncanny similarities between their lives. They were born in the same year. They spent much of their lives in LA. Marilyn, of course, died young. Hefner died well into his 90s. I think he died as an old man. And he actually bought the crypt next to Marilyn Monroe's because he said, I want to spend eternity next to Marilyn.
Oh, wow.
Right. They never actually met. But Marilyn's nudes were printed in the first issue of Playboy. Hefner did buy them, but he didn't buy them from her. He bought them from the photographer who had taken them many years earlier when she was poor and just needed the money. And she was really upset about it. And the reason I use these two stories is because I think that they both really typify the risks to men and women of pursuing the sexual liberation narrative. So in terms of Marilyn, I mean, obviously she died young and tragically. She reportedly had so many abortions that her reproductive organs were permanently injured. She was a very troubled woman. Hugh Hefner had a much better experience of sexual liberation in the sense that he had a great time. He lived to grow old. He was, he had this cornucopia of sexual delights available to him. But the risk there is that. So to the extent that anyone has really benefited from the sexual revolution in an uncomplicated way, it is men like Hugh Hefner, high-status men who are attractive enough to attract loads of women. But even then, I mean, you read the accounts of some of the Playboy bunnies who lived with him in his older years, and it's clear that he became a very tragic figure. And that Playboy lifestyle, I think it's great up until a man is, I don't know, middle-aged. And then after that, it does become kind of, I think he was widely regarded as pathetic once he kind of crossed that threshold. So I think even for Hefner, it was a bit of a poison chalice.
Do you feel like that's an isolated story, or does like an inner conflict with today's kind of sexual culture exist within the majority of women, in your opinion?
Well, she's not isolated in the sense of women who become kind of public sex symbols often have a really hard time. So a more contemporary example would be someone like Britney Spears, who's obviously had a very hard, very public time. It's also true for porn stars. Porn stars tend to have incredibly short life expectancies, the women in particular. Lots of substance abuse issues, lots of mental health issues. This is very common. Now, you might say that there might be some self-selection going on, that the women who end up either in porn or as sex symbols of various kinds publicly might be selecting for neuroticism or something like that, possible. I think, though, honestly, the culture is hard on these women and has been. I mean, and it's this horrible tightrope that women are asked to walk, where on the one hand, the sexual liberation narrative says that this is the most wonderful way in which to liberate yourself and to be publicly adored and everything. But then at the same time, the media and the public will leap on these women and be really savage to them. I say Britney Spears is a really good example of someone who suffered from that, right? I mean, those are very extreme and very public, famous examples. But I think that we see that a lot, actually, this very painful tightrope that women are expected to walk in the post-sexual liberation era, where they often suffer psychological harm and physical harm and are always at risk of, it's not as what people sometimes like to say about the transition we've been through over the last 100 years is it used to be that women were constantly shamed for their sexual behavior. It used to be that it was so easy to stray into across some social limit and then be permanently damned as a slut or a whore or whatever. That's true. It did used to be the case that women were condemned for their sexual behavior. So were men, by the way. I mean, we can get into this, but it's absolutely the case that people used to have much more restrictions placed on their sexuality. But women still have to walk that you can still be condemned for your sexuality in all sorts of ways. It's just more likely to be that you're frigid or that you're a prude or, So I don't think that we are. The point of the book is not to idealize the sexual culture of the past. The point of the book is to point out that there are still all sorts of downsides from the contemporary sexual culture.
Yeah, I really appreciated the nuance of the book because this is such a polarizing conversation. And the first time I was really introduced to it was probably 5-6 years ago. I read a book called American Hookup by Lisa Wade. So she's a sociologist in America. And she, I think for 7 years, was going around college campuses and observing a hookup culture. And, you know, this liberation narrative around female sexuality, I mean, we'll break it down in all its many parts, but, you know, there's OnlyFans and there's porn, there's hookups, there's the objectifying of women and self-objectifying of themselves. But this was really examining the hookup culture, and I thought it was really interesting because it was taking you into this sort of what women were, what they were saying on the outside about participating in this culture, and then what they were experiencing, their internal state when they were experiencing that. And I think it's interesting because, like, what is strange is that the public narrative is that female sexuality is often presented as like empowered and as carefree as ever. And so how do you make sense of that gap between like the private conversations or inner conflict that you describe in your book and then kind of the public story that we all see?
I mean, it is somewhat partisan, right? This is worth laying out. Like, there are different cultural streams operating within, say, America simultaneously. So if you live in liberal America or liberal skewing America, you're more likely to be offered that empowerment narrative. If you live in the Bible Belt, you're obviously going to be offered a different narrative. So there is obviously a range of experiences that you're likely to have. But yeah, I mean, the hookup culture that I'm writing about is very dominant on college campuses and in popular media, and you would struggle not to encounter it, at least somewhat, growing up. And yeah, I mean, the story is basically in the lines of women used to be restricted in their sexuality, and then the sexual revolution came along and everyone kind of realized that they were wrong about that. And we realized that actually women, when given the opportunity to, want to have sex like men. That's the expression that's used in Sex and the City, to have sex like a man. And if only women are given that opportunity, then they'll do that, and they'll be liberated, and their well-being will be improved. There are a few problems with the narrative. I mean, one is that while there absolutely are some women whose preferences are closer to those of the modal man, mm-hmm. right? Who, so in to use the psychological jargon, who have more unrestricted sociosexuality, so are more interested in having sex with more partners and jumping into bed more quickly in a relationship and so on. Those women exist. They are unusual. Like, most women actually, if asked, and I think will quite cheerfully tell their friends as well as pollsters, would rather have a monogamous, committed relationship, and would aim to get married, and would aim to have children, and would actually aim for something quite small c conservative. That is actually the typical preference of most women. That this gap between men and women in terms of sexual preferences, every culture knows about it. Every culture talks about it. Every culture has some way of trying to negotiate this problem and comes up with more or less terrible solutions. I mean, a very typical solution that many societies settle on is to have some women subjected to the sexual double standard. So some women are expected to be chaste until marriage and to never have sex with anyone except their husband. And then a minority of women are prostitutes and are tasked with absorbing all of the excess male sexual energy to their terrible harm. Right? That's what a lot of societies do. They have respectable women and they have unrespectable women. And the unrespectable women, their well-being is just not considered at all. It's completely outside of the scope of sort of moral reasoning in those settings. I feel like what we have done, our attempt to solve this problem, I say our, I mean, post-1960s Western culture, our attempt to solve this problem of the sociosexuality gap is to encourage all women to have sex more like men so as to match the male demand. And what I say, and I think this is really a fundamentally feminist idea, like actually what if it's worse to have unwanted sex than it is to be sexually frustrated? And what if we said instead of women, whether that be prostituted women or all women, having to adjust their sexual behavior to meet the demands of men, what if we actually asked men to match the female desire? That's the claim. It seems like quite a reasonable claim to me.
Yeah, I want to get into that. I think that there is, maybe it's because like certain parts of the media world are just so loud and in your face. But the things that come to mind for me that have been highly influential is in 2020, like Cardi B came out with the song WAP.
Yeah, remember it well.
Yeah, and that was just like #1 hit on the chart, and it was supposed to be this like coming out party of I just want it, and like I'm gonna take it. And there was just such a response from like every major news outlet talking about that. And it almost as if that is right and true and almost somewhat like the stance that we should all be taking, like we're in this like new era. And then the other thing is the rise of OnlyFans in the past 5 years, of porn being this field that essentially was like 10 to 15,000 people. And now you have 3 to 4 million creators on OnlyFans, most of which are doing porn or some sort of pornographic material, whether that's full-on sex acts or that's just nudes or whatever. And that's painted as like this empowerment thing. And then, so then the thing that you see in media is, making millions of dollars, all this stuff. And so I guess my question is like, what do you make of those portrayals or the OnlyFans stars that are going on podcasts kind of like raving about what they do, the pop stars joyfully singing about this? What do you make of those depictions?
So an interesting thing about WAP, which I've not, if you like, it's going to get stuck in my head now just from thinking about it, because it's a great tune, right? But the interesting thing about the lyrics is that actually they're fairly clear in the lyrics that they're doing this for financial gain. It's like, I can't like quote from memory exactly the lines, but it's things like, he'll pay my tuition if I do this. How did I get that ring? Because of sexual favors. It's actually very transactional. It was really interesting that it was portrayed by so many people as a sort of hymn to female sexual liberation, because actually it seemed quite clearly to be the idea is that women perform sex acts for men in return for money or other kinds of gifts. And I mean, similarly, that's obviously the whole point of OnlyFans, that it's women. It's obviously in the interests of women who are on these platforms to present themselves as being very willing participants and very excited and like genuinely turned on by doing all this. But obviously the point of it is to make money. And you think, well, I had a conversation with Bonnie Blue, who's Britain's biggest OnlyFans star.
That was fascinating.
Last year, yeah. Was it last year? And I mean, Bonnie, to her credit, is extremely straightforward about this. She's like, she's thrilled to be making as much money as she is. She's very good at what she does. I think that she has a kind of set of talents which are very uniquely suited to this particular historical moment. It's like she's come along at just the right time to be Bonnie Blue. And I mean, what I said to Bonnie, what I still think is that all she's doing is taking the logic of these various cultural ideas. So the idea of sexual liberation, but also the idea of unlimited capitalism, unlimited in the sense of not being limited by moral scruples, and self-publicization. And, she's taking all of these ideas which are in the culture and which are considered completely laudable in moderation. She's taking them to their logical extreme. And then everyone turns around and so she describes herself as Britain's most hated woman. And she's true, and she attracts an incredible amount of rage. And I think that she's just been completely honest and open and consistent in what she's doing. It's actually the people who say that they generally support sexual liberation but are appalled by Bonnie Blue. I say, why? Bonnie's just been consistent, you know? I have a problem with the ethic behind that, not with the woman herself. I think, don't hate the player, hate the game.
I think what's interesting about the WAP example, going back to that, is, so some of the lyrics in here. So it says, "Look, I need a hard hitter," is one line. Another is, "I'm a freak, handcuffs, leashes." And so there's a lot of language of I need, I want, this is how it is. And to your point earlier, it's like these things were shamed before, and then the sexual liberation is framed as no more shame. We're going to just uncuff you, and it's unrestrained female sexuality.
Yeah.
And so I guess with that, and then the Bonnie Blue example is, do you think that that's an accurate portrayal of what female sexuality actually is, or are people just saying that it is?
Bonnie is a male fantasy, not a female fantasy.
Yeah.
So, women are generally really disgusted by, not necessarily OnlyFans, because obviously OnlyFans can be very tame. But what Bonnie does in terms of the having sex with 1,000 men in a day, those kind of stunts, women tend to find that absolutely toe curling. And when in the lead up to having a conversation with Bonnie, I mentioned to various normal women that I know in my life that I was doing this, and 100% of the responses were physical recoil. All of this is a male fantasy that men buy, right? And that's the transaction. And of course, there is clearly no shortage of women who are willing to meet that demand. And I think there probably always have been to some extent. The question is what society permits and endorses. Because in most times and places, mostly because of contraception, right, which I'm sure we'll get into because that's really the big thing here that's changed so much about sexual culture. Women would only ever do something like that, would only ever risk that level of risk becoming a social pariah because they were absolutely desperate. And it's not a coincidence that women who end up in prostitution are typically have the fewest options available and are the most poor, desperate, bottom of the heap, etc. It's because you end up driven to that because you don't have any other options. Of course, it is different now because there's less social punishment. There's not none. I mean, as discussed, Bonnie is the most hated woman in Britain, supposedly. But there's less, and there's more money to be made because of the digitization. Because Bonnie doesn't make money from having sex with the men. Bonnie makes money from selling the footage, which is infinitely reproducible because it's a digital product. So that does change the market in a very new way. I guess the same is true of pop music. Again, it's a digital product and it's reproducible, and catching people's attention, people's eyeballs in a very heavily saturated media space. Sex is a useful way of doing that. And advertisers and producers and whatever, they can do that. They're allowed to do that. And so they do.
Yeah, I think it's interesting about how sex is not just about sex. It could be about a million other things. And even if you look at today's social media environment, I think there's a tendency to say and do outrageous things because of the attention that's drawn to it.
Yeah, the algorithm wants you to.
Yeah. What is it that provokes such defensiveness around this topic? I mean, you start talking about this, especially in the public square, especially in hyper-liberal type environments, you start talking about this. It seems like the words that we have grown so drawn to and accustomed to are freedom and empowerment.
Yeah.
So why do you feel like just even broaching the topic causes so much defensiveness and controversy?
So probably two reasons. One would be sex is obviously a very intimate, personal thing. And I think the people actually who are often most eager to defend the sexual liberation narrative are women who've been burnt by it. Because it's easier to... My friend Bridget Fettersy, she when she first read my book before we'd met, I dedicate the book to the women who learned it the hard way. And she said she opened that title page and just cried because she was really one of these women who threw herself into hookup culture for various emotional, dysfunctional reasons of her own. And for the longest time would defend it bitterly because I think it is very often much easier to paint yourself as as the agent of your own life and as choosing and embracing all of this harm that's done to you, rather than to accept that actually you you got it wrong, that you were hoodwinked by an ideology. You know, I think that, as well as by various individuals, and coming to terms with having got it wrong is really hard, and will typically trigger exactly what Bridget experienced, this kind of crashing of emotion. So I think part of it is to do with not wanting to believe this interpretation of the world. I think the other thing is that there's a deeper political question around what the good is that goes beyond sex and relationships. So things like freedom, or like a word like progressive. Like, it's so difficult to even talk about some of these things without using very loaded language, which suggests that something's obviously good. Like, people use the word progressive to me as synonymous with good. And
yeah, we're moving forward.
Right. And it's this idea of history having this quite clear shape that before about 1960, everything was terrible and everyone was wrong. And then since then, we're kind of moving upwards in this hopefully inevitable, you know, the arc of history bending towards justice, etc. That paradigm is so baked into not even just the liberal mind. There are a lot of conservatives who are basically signed up to the same principles, that trying to revise it is difficult. It's difficult to even think outside of that paradigm.
Do you feel like when it comes to how a woman should approach her sexuality, or men as well, do you feel like freedom and empowerment is a good goal, or do you feel like there's an alternative goal that would be a better North Star?
I think it can be balanced against other virtues. I think that's what we should aspire to. What's really difficult, though, is trying to work out what you actually want. And that's the real peril of freedom, that it puts so much of the burden on you as the individual to work out what's good for you and work out what you really want. And actually, the human heart is a very complicated thing, and it can be really hard to know, particularly when you're young. Knowing what's going to promote your well-being in the best way is actually really difficult. And you do sort of need other people to help you with that. Just asking people. There obviously are some individuals, maybe Bonnie Blue is an example, right? Some individuals who are very, very clear about themselves and about what they want and about how they're going to get there, who are very agentic, I guess. But they're the exception. Most people aren't like that. And I say I'm not like that. I certainly wasn't when I was a teenage girl. If you've been asking teenage girls, and indeed teenage boys, to construct from scratch, from kind of 101 principles, how one ought to live one's life, is actually a very unkind thing to ask someone to do. I think that what is a much better way to construct a society is to have templates and to have guardrails and to have a rough outline laid out for you about, if you do these things, then you'll have a good life. You should aim to do these things. And yes, there'll be exceptions and there'll be outliers and there'll be people who flex against that rigidity. And societies can be more or less rigid. So a really hard culture, which doesn't permit any kind of deviation from the norm, has serious trade-offs, right? But at the same time, a society in which we just throw it out the window and we ask people to be maximally free all the time, I think generates its own cruelties. And just as often, just people respond actually by being passive. Because the weird thing, right, about sexual culture now is simultaneously there's the liberation narrative, and there's the idea that you should be maximally free all the time and you should be hedonistic, and But then what we actually see in the data is that young people are having less and less sex. So you have a public culture is extremely sexually explicit, and then you have like dead bedroom in reality for most people. It's weird, isn't it? I think that those things might be related, not least because I think when you present young people with maximal sexual freedom, including access to pornography and like of every kind that you can imagine at any moment of the day, because it's on your phone, in your pocket, it seems that people actually often respond by not seeking out real sexual relationships, by being passive and, I guess, rabbit in the headlights, not knowing what to do. I think that too much freedom is bad for us, basically. It doesn't mean that freedom is itself bad, but I think if that's the only thing that you're striving for, then you'll end up with bad outcomes.
You mentioned the word well-being, and so I think that's an interesting kind of North Star. How would you define that word well-being?
What it isn't is necessarily short-term pleasure. What it isn't is focusing only on one metric in your life, so like being as rich as possible, for instance. And I think we can intuit that doesn't necessarily promote your well-being. The well-being has something to do with balancing your long-term interests and your relationships with other people, and it's living a good life. And that's a very difficult thing to pin down. Except that my instinct is to say that for most people, what that will look like will be normal, even boring.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like the idea of boredom is not just constrained to the sexual domain. I think we are at odds with the boredom thing across the entire human experience. I mean, there was this video on, I think the Harvard Business Review released this video about boredom and something about embracing boredom. And this was like last year, and it got like 13 million views. And I thought that was really interesting because the constant simulation, the constant go, the constant phone, I think sexuality is like probably the most extreme form of the constant pursuit of pleasure.
Yeah. I think it's just one facet though of a wider thing. Yeah.
Constant pursuit of pleasure, constant pursuit of stimulation. And if you're constantly going after that, I would say that that's probably at odds with your well-being.
Yeah. Did you read that fantastic essay? I forget the name of the writer now, but it was in Harper's Magazine last year about gooners. So
I've heard this term though.
Okay, so a gooner is basically someone who consumes internet porn in a really dysfunctional way. That is kind of an online subculture, and the idea behind it is that you might be able to. I think it's all men. I don't think women are involved in the online gooning community. That you might be able to use porn and masturbation to sort of achieve enlightenment. There's a sort of spiritual idea that you can almost break your brain to the extent that you cross into some different form of consciousness. I don't know if anyone has ever actually achieved that. I think that's the goal. But what's evident from how gooning manifests online is that sexuality becomes weirder and weirder and number, and they need more and more strange, not just pornography but also sex toys and all sorts of things in order to achieve anything like the high that they had on that first time. It's kind of like drugs in that sense. And this essay in Harper's is just fantastic on this. But the point he makes at the end, which is so true, is that obviously goonas are a very, very extreme version of this rush towards hedonism at all times and towards stimulation at all times. There's one of the guys who's interviewed, and it says at one point something like they put together these edits of porn that's like, it's like the logical conclusion of short form video culture. They edit together the most extreme bits of porn, like to a techno beat, and it's like the clips are timed with the beat. And so watching the video is like this explosion of stimulation in your brain. And one of the guys interviewed says something like, I just want to get more and more porn in my brain. It's the most efficient way to get porn in my brain. And the point that the writer makes is like, yeah, this is a very extreme example. And these guys typically ruin their lives. That they don't have girlfriends, you may be surprised to hear. They don't like really hold down jobs. It really ruins them. But actually the internet kind of pushes us all to behave like that. Like this craving sensation from your phone, I want to get more of it in my brain. That's actually a pretty normal experience nowadays. There are loads of people who have that kind of relationship with the internet. So in some sense, the goonas are just the more extreme and more obvious example of a wider dysfunction.
So, I mean, if we looked at well-being as the goal or like a scaffolding for how to look at the sexual experience, I think that begs the question of looking honestly about what both men and women have been taught about sex and kind of what living inside those things has cost them.
You mean nowadays?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, you get this very inconsistent take, which is on the one hand, the idea that it's safer to be like this online meme that it's safer to be alone with a grizzly bear than it is to be alone with a man. Mm-hmm. So women will often have women of a certain generation, like my generation and younger, will have a very pessimistic attitude towards men, like openly quite despising men sometimes, combined with a valorization of having casual sexual encounters with men and going home to the grizzly bear's flat and having sex with them. Like it's quite strange. Like these things seem to be obviously contradictory. But there's a lot of that. There's a lot of contradiction within the message. So, you know, on the one hand, it's very important to promote empowerment and agency and choice. But then isn't it funny how everyone ends up sticking to roughly the same templates in a setting where apparently you'd expect a wide range of experiences if everyone was pursuing their own independence as much as possible. And yet that's not what you see. You actually see, I mean, what you see in practice is lots of situationships, lots of kind of serial monogamy that like stretches on and on, people getting married late, if at all. I mean, that's kind of that's what people have drifted into post-sexual liberation. And of course, it's all enabled by contraception. Because as all of our ancestors lived in a world where having sex, as from the woman's perspective, was one of the most consequential decisions she could make, because the risk of getting pregnant was very real. And then you have this very glaring question of what do you do about that? You know, It's not just that abortion was illegal; it's also that abortion up until recently was very dangerous. And we didn't really have the technology to perform safe abortions. So if you do get pregnant, you're faced with having the baby, which is dangerous to you, and then having the baby adopted or raising the baby yourself, or attempting an abortion, which is dangerous, or committing infanticide. Like there's some very stark options here, right? And that's what all of our female ancestors always faced when they were thinking about sexual relationships. And in that context, it obviously makes sense to be very picky about who you have sex with. And you would expect social infrastructure to emerge to try and regulate that decision-making. As a parent of a teenage girl, you really don't want your teenage girl to get knocked up by some bozo. You really don't want that to happen. And that's not because you're a misogynist. That's because you have a completely rational idea about what's in your daughter's best interests. And when the baby comes along, that baby is the community's problem. And in societies that are quite close to the scarcity threshold, to the, I don't mean scarcity, what do I mean? Subsistence threshold, caring for having another mouth to feed is not a trivial thing. So it all becomes the community's problem, you know, in a world without contraception. In a world with contraception and with safe legal abortion, everything changes. I mean, it doesn't mean that unwanted pregnancies never come along. Unwanted pregnancies probably come along more often than in the past because people behave as if there's no link between sex and pregnancy. But in fact, contraception fails really quite a lot. I think it's something like half of pregnancies in the US are unplanned. So the idea that everyone now has absolute control over their reproductive lives isn't true. Like, contraception is actually quite flimsy, and definitely early on, the early versions of the pill, not very good. But it was reliable enough to produce this social break where having sex is no longer thought of as this very consequential act. It's thought of as a hobby. In which case, yeah, going home with whoever as a woman no longer becomes even an especially important decision. It can just become a...
Well, I think that's what's interesting is because if you look at, I guess, probably before the 1960s, I mean, the extremes of having no sex before marriage, I mean, that's like an extremely high bar to set in terms of even
Although
entering
it is the norm across most societies.
Yeah. And so now, probably post Me Too, it's like, just get consent. And it's like not a big deal.
Yeah.
And so like consent is...
That's the bar. Yeah. Which is a stupidly low bar. Because there are so many scenarios you can imagine where there is consent, like technically, like legal consent, but it's still a bad situation. There are loads of those kind of scenarios. And how do you think about them if you're... Which is one of the reasons why one of the things we saw during Me Too and since is women who have had bad sexual experiences, but legal sexual experiences, or like just over that, you know, maybe hovering around the boundary of whether or not consent was really there. But often I can think, I won't name names, but just thinking about some of the famous men who've had Me Too accusations made against them, they're not necessarily criminal accusations. Like, they're typically not criminal accusations, actually. They're like, you told me you loved me and you didn't. Or you had another woman on the go and you didn't tell me. Or I was under the impression that you were going to call me the next day and you didn't. It's those kind of things where it's not illegal, but it is bad. But when you have this idea that consent is the only real moral factor at play, then sometimes women who've been on the receiving end of this kind of lack of chivalry will try and interpret it. Will say, oh no, but actually I wasn't consenting. Will basically use the only tool they have in their moral arsenal to try and refashion the experience into something that didn't meet the consent threshold. And it's like, it did meet the consent threshold, actually. Like, from your account, he didn't fail to meet that very low legal bar. What he failed to do was to behave morally. But that kind of vocabulary is very difficult to use if you're really signed up to the sexual liberation view of relationships.
What are some scenarios that you see that technically there's consent, but would lead to some very adverse outcomes for women?
Well, adverse in terms of like emotionally adverse outcomes.
Psychologically, yeah.
So like, there was a kind of a fairly, Andrew Huberman's Me Tooing was kind of fairly late in the day, but that was an example where I don't think anyone actually alleged. So the allegation basically is that he's like polyamorous in a slightly coercive way. So he is having relationships with multiple women at the same time, kind of more or less seriously, and these women didn't necessarily know about each other, or sometimes they knew about each other. It was all kind of hazy. There's a lot of dishonesty. And everyone, it seems, came away from that feeling grubby and used and unhappy, and that they'd been lied to. But nothing illegal happened. Not according to our current laws. I mean, I don't think there was any suggestion that he was certainly not violent, anything like that. He was, in a way, I mean, he was just playing he was playing within the rules of a sexual culture in which polyamory is completely fine. And you don't have to commit to women that you're having sex with. You don't even have to commit to the mother of your children. Like, he wasn't within that framework as a high status man who has no shortage of women who want to have relationships with you. That is technically permitted, but you'll notice that women get pretty mad about it because it's not actually honoring the dignity of your sexual partners to behave like that. But phrases like that, honoring the dignity of someone, like that's a weird thing to say. That's a countercultural thing to say, particularly in that kind of like Californian social scene, you know, where everyone is operating. So that it's very hard if you're in this position where you're a woman, you feel like you're being wronged, you feel angry, you feel upset. You probably are not going to have that kind of moral vocabulary that you can call on those moments to justify why you're feeling that way. So you might instead call on the vocabulary of consent, but that wouldn't really accurately describe what was going on.
It's really an interesting example because at the baseline, like if you're having sex with them, you're both consenting to having sex, but then there's this additional layer of offense about honesty about what else is going on in your life and all these other things. You had included a striking thought experiment from Jonathan Haidt about chickens in your book.
Yes.
I think that's interesting when you consider the idea of a baseline environment. Can you unpack that and why it kind of exposes the limits of consent?
So Jonathan Haidt has this whole theory around morality, which is very interesting, where he, this is from The Righteous Mind, which he published some years ago, where there are kind of moral flavors that people are more or less receptive to. I can't remember what they all are, but it's things like the Care Harm Foundation, Sacredness Foundation, things like that. And liberals, Haidt argues, tend to be sensitive to just a few of those moral flavors. Conservatives are sensitive to those as well, but they also have some additional moral flavors which they're sensitive to, which is one of the reasons why there's this well-researched difference between liberals and conservatives in terms of their ability to understand each other. So generally, conservatives are actually pretty good when they're asked in a research setting, what do you think liberals think about this? Conservatives are pretty good at accurately describing what liberals think about this.
Yeah.
Liberals tend to be pretty bad at accurately describing what conservatives think about things. They'll often say something like, oh, it's just because they're like bad people or something. Like they won't be able to really summon up like a convincing explanation for how the other person feels. And that seems to be to do with this moral flavors issue. It's because there are moral flavors that conservatives can taste and that liberals can't taste, which include things like sacredness and loyalty and deference to tradition and things like that. Like most liberals just don't think those are important, whereas conservatives do. And so that can affect how they think about moral scenarios. So Jonathan Haidt looked into this by coming up with various scenarios, which he'd present to research participants and ask them, what do you think about this? And often he'd find that his liberal participants would struggle when they encountered scenarios which felt gross and bad, but didn't actually violate the principles that they could sort of explicitly sign up to. So the chicken example is a man goes to a supermarket and he buys a dead chicken, and he goes home and he has sex with it. He doesn't tell anyone, no one witnesses it, the chicken is dead, can't be harmed. Did he do anything wrong? And conservatives immediately say, like, yes, obviously, because it's gross. So they say, well, it violates the sacredness principle or something like that, because you don't have sex with animals, you don't have sex with anything dead, like, end of. He's done something wrong. He's betrayed a lack of virtue by doing this, even if no one else ever finds out about it. Whereas liberals struggle because they're like, oh, I don't know if the chicken could consent. So it's like the only way of understanding it is through, was anyone harmed? No, I guess the man wasn't harmed. The chicken wasn't harmed. No one witnessed it, so they weren't harmed. Did everyone consent? Well, the chicken can't consent. The man did. So yeah, I guess it's fine. But like, no one actually wants to say this is fine. Like most people's instincts are towards finding it disgusting. And so liberals end up in this difficult situation of having to try and rationalize away their instinctive disgust. which causes some cognitive dissonance. And I think you see that quite often in much less extreme examples of sexual misbehavior.
I mean, it is an extreme example, but I thought, the underlying logic behind it was interesting because, and it ties into the Huberman thing, because you might say something about what you think should constitute as a sexual environment or scenario in which you would be permissible to enter into, but then you really think about it, and at your core, what you like truly believe is at odds, and there's like some conflict painful with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, even if people listening or someone that would subscribe to a more liberal view of sexual liberation could agree that some consensual situations can still be unhealthy, some would perhaps argue that that doesn't automatically mean that casual sex or hookup culture should be written off altogether. And this is interesting because I've spoken to sex therapists, and they get in this kind of quandary too of like, I'm trying to take them on a journey of like, well, what would be those scenarios that would be fine in a casual sex or hookup culture? Mm-hmm. And I think the numbers around this are eye-opening in terms of how common hookups have become for women. In the 1950s, only 2% of women had more than 10 sexual partners. Today, it's 25%. And so that's like, what is that, 10 times what it was?
Yeah.
And so one way to read that is simply that women now have sexual freedom and we're seeing their true sexual appetite exposed. And do you think that explanation holds up?
I think that's probably true for a very small number of women. I think what's more common, so one thing to say about this is there's a physical asymmetry also with heterosexual sex, in that women are the ones who get pregnant, so they suffer 100% of the adverse outcomes from that. And whether that be raising a child unexpectedly or having an abortion or whatever it is. And also women are so much smaller and weaker than men that, men have roughly double the upper body strength that women have on average. It's a difference that I think a lot of modern people actually don't quite appreciate how big the difference is. Maybe it comes from not play fighting with siblings as much, like having smaller families. But I remember doing, when I was training, started doing jiu-jitsu and tried to like use out jiu-jitsu techniques I'd learned on my husband, and he just like within seconds. It is so rare for a woman to be that strong and fit that she can overpower an average man or even a subpar man. I mean, like you look at like grip strength graphs for men and women, it's pretty amazing. So there's a physical asymmetry there, which means that if a man and a woman are alone together, the woman is always at a disadvantage, almost always at a disadvantage, which does mean that if you're going to merrily participate in hookup culture as a woman, you're carrying risks that the men aren't carrying. Like your risk of being raped, assaulted, made pregnant. Women get STDs more easily than men as well. It's just the nature of like the physiology that it's easier to transmit an STD that way. So the risks are high, and it does mean that you have to really want to do it to make that worthwhile. And there are women for whom that's true, who have such unrestricted sociosexuality that their psychological gratification is enough to outweigh that. I've met these women, I've spoken to them, I believe them, when they tell me that that's how they sincerely feel. But they're not the norm. And what's happening more often is that, so sometimes women will have hookups in the hope of it being a gateway to a relationship. So that's one strategy that's employed. Like you have a hookup with someone because actually you'd like him to be your boyfriend. And that can be a way of kind of getting a foot in the door. So this is something that, and that can evolve into a situationship, which might evolve into a real relationship and into a marriage. Like it does happen. So that can be one motivation aside from sexual pleasure. It's worth saying again that like the proportion of women who orgasm during one-night stands is so low. Again, so even if compared with in committed relationships, it's a massive difference. So again, it's like if you want to say that 25% of women or whoever who are having quite a lot of sexual partners are doing it just for their own physical gratification, like it doesn't actually seem that plausible, honestly. I think there are other things going on which are more to do with social conformity or being agreeable. Like, honestly, it sounds crazy. I've had conversations with men about this, and the men just do not believe me. They're like, I would never have sex with someone just to be polite. And I say, I know you wouldn't have sex with someone just to be polite, but I can tell you there are absolutely women who will do that, who will feel like, oh, I've had a date with this guy and he's really nice, and like I feel bad. Like, okay, genuinely. And I think there's a mutual misunderstanding sometimes between the sexes, that men struggle to imagine feeling that way. And women are a bit embarrassed to admit it. And I don't know. Obviously, there's a range of experiences, but there are one group of people who struggle now in the post-sexual revolution culture are very agreeable women who are quite impressionable. And being young makes you more agreeable and more impressionable. And who are desperate to please and really struggle to defend their own boundaries, including their own sexual boundaries. Because the way that it used to be for those women, if you're like that, that's your personality. Let's say you're like 18, so you're quite young. The default assumption 100 years ago was that if you went on a date with a young man, you would not be having sex. That was the default assumption. So you didn't have to defend your own sexual boundaries, because the assumption would be that you would not be having sex until you got married. Whereas now the assumption is that you probably will. And so all of a sudden, instead of those women just having to follow the default, those women are actually having to stand up for themselves and having to be assertive and say, no, I actually reject the default assumption. I'm going to offer something countercultural, which is to not have sex. And often those women don't want to do that. That's actually a really hard thing to ask someone really agreeable in the presence of someone much bigger and stronger than her to do. And I think that those young women, those girls I just refuse to recognize that as sexual liberation for those young women and girls. I think that they've actually been harmed by the changes to the culture that we've seen.
You mentioned the orgasm thing, and I think that's interesting because I pulled some numbers on this. So 10% of women orgasm in one-night stands compared to 90% of men, which is, and you cited some of these numbers in your book, which is just really interesting because if you think about the pleasure, and so if you were to look at committed relationships, the number for women is just like way higher.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to hookup culture or casual sex, I mean, that's telling a story about who it's really designed around.
Right, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you might get other kinds of psychological gratification, like feeling sexy, feeling desired. Like sometimes a benefit that a woman can get from a one-night stand is it makes her feel good about herself for a bit. But then it is often a bad deal because you might feel good in the moment, but then when he doesn't want to see you again, you feel terrible. So it can be a short-term benefit. But yeah, there were plenty of feminists in the second wave who recognized this as well. Like Andrea Dworkin was one of the feminists of the second wave who said that actually the push to decriminalize abortion, it was not a coincidence that Hugh Hefner was one of the people really pushing for this, and that plenty of men were pushing for this. Because it did mean that suddenly men had sexual access to women to whom they would not otherwise have had sexual access. It doesn't mean that, there's obviously a whole debate to be had there, right? But this has been noted for some time by feminists that men benefit from hookup culture way more than they will typically admit.
Yeah, one of the ironies I keep coming back to with hookup culture is that, like, first of all, it's hard enough in a committed relationship, in a marriage, to talk openly about sex.
Yeah.
So, like, the needs, the boundaries, fantasies, a lot of people never have those conversations.
Yeah.
It's just hard. And every single sex therapist we've had on this podcast has said the same thing. So why would we ever expect in casual sex with strangers or near strangers to somehow have this, like, to meet this, like, generous, attentive person, or have like a sex positive environment for women? I don't know how you could ever expect that if someone who genuinely cares about you in a marriage or committed relationship has a hard time doing that.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, it's the perfect setting for horrible miscommunication, particularly when you add alcohol. So you have people who don't really know each other, might be very drunk, and then are relying on these subtle physical cues as to what the other person wants. It's not a surprise at all that you end up with encounters which are later interpreted as being coercive and non-consensual. Because, yeah, I mean, there's this bias that not a lot of people know about, where men tend to generally see sexual interest in other people when it isn't there. There's a kind of a bias towards overestimating how much that other person is into you. And that bias is aggravated by alcohol. So, like, going back to the college campus setting, you can't really imagine a better scenario for generating sexual assault than this setting where the expectation is that casual sex is normal, everyone's drunk, and you've got all these overexcited young men and women who don't really know each other. Like, it would be incredible if that didn't result in very painful misunderstandings.
Also, you brought this up, alluded to it earlier, but there was a lot of shame in the 50s, obviously, around sexual partners, but it's not like that has just went away. And so the idea of like high body counts for women, how would you say that affects their reputation moving forward, especially when they're trying to actually like meet somebody to settle down with?
So there's one narrative around this, which is the quite extreme, like, anti-feminist narrative, which is that women who have a high body count will never get married, and they will kind of get used up and then hit the wall and have really tragic lives. I don't think that's true. I think there are loads of women, including famous porn stars, who do sometimes go on to get married and have children and to have perfectly like functional relationships. So I don't want to do the full. I think there's a version of this account that is way too extreme.
Yep.
But men generally do not look for a high body count in a potential wife. Like they won't say that generally. That's kind of hush hush. But men will confide in each other or in their friends that that's not exactly what they're looking for. And similarly, women will say rude things about people behind their backs. I mean, yeah, like sexual shame hasn't gone away. It's just been sort of subverted and is maybe more veiled in the ways that it's expressed. But the sexual double standard is definitely still there.
I mean, if you zoom out from all of this, like the consent framework, hookup culture, orgasm gap, reputational costs, it does feel like there's something that underlies all of this, and that is the male experience versus the female experience. And you said this off the top. It was like you talked about Sex and the City, and so there's a scene in your book. You described a moment from the very first episode of Sex and the City that I feel like captures that more than anything else. Can you explain what that scene is and what you think it reveals about what women have been striving for sexually?
So the protagonist, Carrie, she goes and has a lunchtime hookup with an ex-boyfriend who she has no intention of getting back together with, and who she doesn't even like really, but is attractive. And she goes to his apartment and he gives her oral sex, and then she doesn't reciprocate. She just leaves. So she's selfish, right? And then she says, I left feeling elated. I'd had sex like a man. And it was kind of part of this discussion with the characters within the show about whether women could have sex like a man, like truly emotionally disconnected and selfish and non-reciprocal. And I think I'm not alone in thinking that that's a very weird ideal to, like, she behaved badly, okay? She didn't behave illegally, but she behaved in the way that women have been complaining about men behaving forever. And I don't know why anyone would think that this was something that women ought to aspire. It's going back to this question about like, should women try and imitate male sexuality, or should men try and imitate female sexuality? At least in terms of like number of partners and monogamy and so on. It's not obvious to me that women imitating the male norm is the preferable option, let alone the feminist option.
Why would women want to have sex like men?
You tell me. I don't know. I suppose because it's kind of like a kicking back against traditionalism, and so much of this culture is about reacting to Christianity. It's the whole of the sexual revolution. I mean, the political revolution that came out of the 60s, which we're still living through, is highly reactive. Like, so much of it is framed around rejecting specifically the 1950s, but really rejecting the Christian moral norms that prevailed and which have rapidly lost power over the last few generations, and not least when it comes to sexuality. So I think a lot of what's going on with the having sex like a man thing is it's rebelling against this kind of imagined Christian patriarch of a previous era. It's doing exactly what he would not want us to do.
One thing that came up when I was reading your book is this idea of people saying that there aren't differences between men and women, and any perceived differences between men and women are kind of socialized.
Yeah.
And that we all kind of come out of the womb as a blank slate, and so we could assume the roles of each. And I thought it was interesting because you applied to evolutionary biology to kind of examine that assumption that men and women are the same. And so what did you find when you looked at that?
It's complicated because there is a lot of variation. So there's one account of this would be to say that there are these absolute differences between men and women psychologically. There are absolute differences between men and women, but they're physical ones. And even then, I mean, something like strength differences, you will get occasionally women who are stronger than men, right? So similarly with the psychological differences, there are lots of different psychological differences between men and women. Some of them are quite small and some of them are quite large. So the metaphor that a friend of mine who's an evolution biologist came up with, which I think is really nice, if I can explain it well, is it's kind of like someone's facial features. Like, we know that there are average differences between men and women in terms of what their faces look like, such that we can, if we look at a face, we can pretty much immediately clock it as male or female. Mm-hmm. And those differences will be things like nose length, like men have bigger noses, men have heavier brows, men have heavier jaws, things like that. But you might sometimes get a woman who is otherwise looks very feminine but has a big nose, or looks very feminine but has a heavy jaw or something. So generally you will expect these traits to cluster such that you will look at a face and like there might be some outlier factors, but in general that face looks pretty typical of their sex. Yeah. That is also kind of true of personality. So even if you might have one trait in your personality which is very gender non-conforming, most people will have a personality which looks quite feminine and looks quite masculine in the composite, if that makes sense. So I'm an example of this. I generally have quite a feminine personality. Like on most of the metrics where you are, there are differences between the sexes, I will generally be at the more feminine end. I'm like pretty sex typical in most things. But one way in which I'm a freak is that I am quite contrarian. So women tend to be less contrarian than men. Women tend to be more inclined to agree with the consensus and to prioritize relationships over truth. So to prioritize getting along with people over saying controversial things. I clearly have not done that. Like my career is evidence of this. But in every other way. So I'm like a woman with a big nose. You know, I'm otherwise have a feminine personality and then I have this one unusual trait. So there are lots of examples of that. So some of the traits that we know, we see differences. Women are more agreeable than men are. Women are more neurotic than men are, which means women are more sensitive to negative emotion. Women are have more restricted sociosexuality, as discussed. There are all these sometimes quite subtle differences, but they do add up, and it does mean that when you're looking at the population level and you're deciding, for instance, like what sort of sexual culture would meet female interests best? What sort of sexual culture would meet male interests best? You can come up with a pretty good answer to that in terms of how people's personalities tend to differ. And there will be outliers. And the outliers are kind of painful and difficult because it's like the suburbia point earlier, like there will be people who don't want to fit inside that norm for their own reasons, perfectly legitimate reasons. It doesn't mean though that you shouldn't have a norm. I think you need to, when you're thinking about laws and norms and macro ideas, you need to be thinking about what people are generally like. And when you're thinking about sexual politics, that's definitely true.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of like, and I don't know if this is the core issue, but I think the binary thinking or binary statements, I think really offend people. And for one reason or another, it seems like we've become obsessed with the minority of things, right? And so, which on one level, when it comes to the liberation of minority people groups is great. But basically what ends up happening is like you take the minority people group and then you make that sort of the norm, or you kind of assume that that's the reality for everyone.
Like highly sociosexual women.
Exactly, yeah. Instance, and so why do you think we do that?
I guess it's partly an overcorrection to, like my family are Australian. My grandmother has told me about growing up in kind of outer suburban Australia in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when Australia was more conservative than Britain and America at the same time. Like she would put on her hat and gloves just to go to the shops. It was that kind of very formal culture. And she talks about like if you had shown up at a party in the era when swing skirts was the fashion, wearing a 1920s flapper dress that you'd got from a vintage shop, people would look at you like you were insane. Like there was that little room for maneuver, that even wearing vintage clothes was outside of the norm in a really suspicious and alarming way. So that's an extreme version of this kind of culture, which is dead set on having everyone behave in exactly the same way. And there are obviously bad things about that. And I think people who were sensitive to those downsides have had a lot of cultural sway in endorsing a kind of an overcorrection. But it doesn't, I mean, I wish that there was some like happy medium that we could permanently reach. I think it is sort of the nature of human beings to do this though, to cycle through, you react against something and then you go too far and then you react the other way. I think that we'll always do that.
I mean, I think it's such an important point to underscore, because I think it is incredibly valuable to understand that most women, not all women, are unlike men. You had this really interesting example about what happens on the gay hookup scene. That an unexpected example, but like when you pointed to this data, I thought it was really interesting. So can you explain that versus what you saw with lesbians?
Well, again, like there is variation.
Yeah.
But in general, gay men are much more promiscuous than straight men. Straight men would be that promiscuous if women would agree to, have sex as men want to.
Yeah.
But the nature of the gay scene is that it's entirely composed of men, like obviously. So it ends up conforming to male sexual preferences. Again, like there is variation. The expression that I've coined for this is the horny quartile. There's like there's a quartile of men-ish who will have, when they will have enormous numbers of sexual partners and be very sexually adventurous. And then there's a middle section of people who are somewhere in the middle. Then there's gay men who behave like lesbians, right? So there is a full range of experience. But certainly like the gay scene, in terms of men who are involved in like Grindr and going to clubs and stuff like that and bathhouses, are way more promiscuous. And like it does kind of prove the point about these innate differences. And similarly, the joke about lesbians is like, what does a lesbian bring on a second date? A U-Haul, like lesbians do tend to settle down earlier, get married more often, suffer from more bed death. Like all the stereotypes and the jokes about how life differs for gay and lesbian people, they do roughly map onto reality. mean, that's one of the findings from psychology, which is best replicated stereotype accuracy. Like, people actually tend to be very good at coming up with stereotypes that roughly do describe how groups behave. And so, yeah, I mean, Sex and the City was written by a gay man, right? And Samantha, who's the really promiscuous character, was based on a real person who was a gay man. So, like, to some extent, what's being described in Sex and the City is the New York gay scene, not the New York heterosexual scene. I mean, obviously, it's beautifully written. It's a great show. I don't want to be like dunking on Sex and the City all the time. It's a really good show. It's very funny, whatever. And it does a good job of describing some aspects of women's lives. But a lot of it is clearly heavily influenced by the fact that it's written by a gay man. Yeah.
I mean, that example stuck out to me because, I mean, this isn't just a theory. Like, it stuck out because of how many gay people have told me that's the reality of, like, what it's like on the gay hookup scene and how people end up behaving. Another point of data I thought, and this is kind of where I first encountered this narrative of differences between male and female sexuality. I mean, Emily Nagosi, who's like a sex therapist, she had a really popular book that came out probably a decade ago, but she was citing the data on how 75% of men have what's called spontaneous desire, meaning they just see a naked body and are ready to go. So they're essentially visual, but only 15% of women are like this, and the majority are closer to something called responsive desire, where the appetite for sex only starts once it's begun, many times with emotional connection as the precursor to the experience. So again, it's not absolutes. Like you said, women high sociosexuality would probably maybe be more spontaneous. Yeah. But generally speaking, like, that's like a huge difference.
Yeah, right. And I think that people don't really know this about them. It's one of the problems with having a culture. I mean, there's a whole load of problems with the blank slate idea, not least that it's completely false. But the widespread belief that there aren't really important differences between men and women is a problem, because it means that people don't understand the world accurately and they don't understand themselves. So it would be useful, actually, I think, for a lot of women to know that they're very likely to be one of these responsive people who will only want to have sex once another person has initiated and they have so, I mean, the word that's been coined to try and deal with this is demisexual. So women will describe themselves as demisexual as if it was some, like, vulnerable sexual minority. It's just normal female sexuality that they're describing. So the desire to only have sex with someone with whom you have some degree of commitment. But it's easier to express, it's easier to attach a kind of politicized word to yourself, like demisexual, than it is to face up to these average differences, I guess. I mean, that's part of why I wrote the book, because I think there's just so much basic stuff that young women in particular don't know, young men don't know. And it causes confusion because men and women don't understand each other because they haven't been given access to basic information, which I think our ancestors mostly would have known because they would just learn it from the people around them. And there'd be no weird taboo on discussing this stuff in public.
Yeah, so I think the outcome of everything that we're discussing is, it seems like the sexual culture of today works for a very small subset of women, works for the majority of men. But
well, majority, I don't know. Some proportion. Like, there are also loads of men who are not getting laid at all and are not happy at all.
Well, it seems to bring about the worst male behavior. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like naming all of this doesn't necessarily bring peace for some women, because it might actually bring anger and resentment. And what I mean by that is, like, if women tried to have sex like men as a response to male behavior, I mean, that in a sense is a sort of powerlessness, a giving into that. And so if it's not been working, it feels like another instance where women have to kind of absorb the fact that men behave badly.
Well, I think the only thing that we can do right now, like, the pill's not going to get these are lasting changes to the incentives within sexual culture. The only thing that individuals can do is to be more assertive about their own true desires, and eventually that scales. So if you have enough women who are quite agentic and contrarian and are willing to say the low status thing, then the hope is that cascades, and then you ultimately hit the agreeable, very impressionable women who at the moment are having unwanted sex out of politeness. Like if you can move the social norms such that that's no longer what's expected, then that can be quite powerful. And I think, honestly, to some extent, that's happening already. Like when I wrote this, I mean, if anything, the overcorrection is like well and truly underway. Like when I first finished this book, I think I had a bit in the epilogue where I say, you see some signs online of like trad wife culture or whatever coming back, coming anew in the digital space, which it suggests that maybe there might be a correction incoming. And I think that's absolutely what has happened in the last several years. And if anything, what you sometimes see now is a sort of, and it's very partisan, is a really full throttle sexual conservatism that's alive in, say, like young Republican spaces in DC. The talk of body counts is no longer quiet, like it's completely explicit. And women will be, the sexual double standard is completely back, and, being completely chaste before marriage is now no longer a weird thing to expect of people. And so we're seeing the swing back. I mean, I wish it was a swing back which didn't come with like constant talk of disenfranchising women. And, there's obviously I think corrections are very, very quickly followed by overcorrections.
It's hard to, I mean, that's what I appreciate so much about your work, is that like it's hard to, for some reason it's hard for people to like live in the middle of something. And you wrote a lot about how like the 1950s, like everything is sort of like a mixed bag, and how everything wasn't all bad in the 1950s, but that doesn't mean everything was all good, and everything isn't all bad today, but that doesn't mean everything is all good.
Yeah.
But we treat it as such. And so the ping-ponging between these kind of binaries, and it feels like it just feels outrageous. Like one thing isn't working, or the majority of it isn't working, and so then we ping-pong the other way, and then...
Yeah. And it's also because there's a tendency within the culture, understandably, to zero in on the extreme examples. So, when we think of the 1950s, we will tend to think of the most extreme examples of, censorship of movies or kind of extreme conservatism. And I imagine when people look back at our era, they will zero in on the extreme examples as well, because those are interesting. Obviously, throughout most of history, like most people have lived normal-ish lives in suburban houses or similar. Most people have not... have never gravitated towards the extremes. And I'd say that the center of the culture moves much more slowly, but certainly within political discourse, you can see some really big shifts.
So if someone's listening and we would kind of future cast about what is the... If they're thinking, is the solution to all this to go back to the 1950s, what would your response be?
Well, then the 1950s there are a lot of unusual things about the 1950s in a whole load of ways. It's kind of impossible for us to not think of it as it's the most proximate period before the sexual revolution. So I think it's sort of natural. And for many of us, it's the era when our grandparents were young. So it's quite easy to think of it as the obvious alternative. But there are lots of ways in which the 1950s were unusual, not least in the fact that this was the era when the nuclear family was really the idealized family model. Historically, the extended family is a much more common model, etc. So there are, I think it's unhelpful for us to focus too much on that one decade. I find it useful. So my first degree was in anthropology, and I've kind of carried that lens with me into my work as a journalist. And there's this idea in anthropology of the anthropologist's veto. So if you can find an example of a culture that doesn't do something, that will typically tell you that it's not a human universal. And there have been various efforts to come up with human universals down the years, of which there are loads. Like every culture has warfare of some kind, every culture has music, every culture has baby carrying devices, like, the list goes on. And I think it's useful to not focus on the 1950s, but to instead look at the whole sweep of human history and think, if there are these innate differences between men and women that are true across time and place, people are coming up with ways to deal with that, to manage that. And some of those ways are bad, right? So the example I gave earlier of having a class of prostituted women. So like say what the ancient Roman world did, having a class of enslaved prostituted women who didn't have any choice about who they had sex with, and then having a class of respectable women who only had sex with their husbands. I don't propose that, okay, as a model, but that is one way of dealing with this problem. I think what's helpful though, if you're trying to come up with something constructive, is to look across time and place and say, okay, what are the common factors? What are the solutions that people often revert to? What are the better or worse ways of dealing with the nature of human sexuality? And one thing that you see very consistently, for instance, across time and place is marriage as an institution. Because marriage is a way of, yes, controlling sexuality, male and female, but it's also a way of making men legally and socially responsible for their children in a way, and for the mothers of their children, in a way that some men will otherwise try and avoid that responsibility. There really is I make in the book the feminist case for marriage. Like there is a case for marriage which is very much in women's interests. And I think that I think it's hubristic to try and throw some of these very ancient ideas out of the window and to try and reinvent human sexuality from the ground up. Because even if we now have the pill, so in some senses we are completely different from our ancestors, because we can at least give the impression of suspending the link between sex and reproduction in a way that they just couldn't do. We're not psychologically different from them, really. Like not in our fundamentals. Like our brains are not vastly different from those of people 200 or 2,000 or 20,000 years ago. And our brains don't know that we're taking the pill. For instance, it's not when women get attached to their sexual partners in situationships when they're on the pill, they're getting attached to these men because they think that their minds think that they're liable to get pregnant by these men. Like that's not a silly thing to do, actually. Your body is responding completely normally. You get this rush of hormones when you have sex with someone, which are there to bond you to someone for a very sensible goal, which is raising children together. You can't actually disable those responses, really. You can try and suppress them, but we are still really Stone Age people, and we have our instincts are towards...
Even if we're not consciously thinking that.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you're trying to learn from human history, I think the useful thing to do is to look for the commonalities and also to look for the ways in which we are massive outliers. There are loads of ways in which we're massive outliers. And, it's possible that might work, that we can be a very different type of society and make it work nonetheless. But I I'm kind of skeptical about our ability to psychologically cope with that. And that doesn't just come down to sex. I think there are lots of things that we can learn from deep human history about what actually makes people happy.
What do you feel like, whether it's the 1950s or you go back farther than that or look at other ancient cultures, what do you feel like we got wrong that maybe led to this sort of revolution or rebellion or whatever? And what do you think the things that we need to redeem if we look at things like a mixed bag?
So aside from the idea that sexuality shouldn't be controlled, that's a very novel idea. It's very strange. Not just female. I mean, female sexuality is what gets focused on, but male sexuality as well. Of course, male sexuality needs to be controlled.
Yeah,
male sexuality is a really potent force, and actually, it's a problem that society's that a lot of people down the ages have put a lot of thought into. Like, what do you do about young men who, on the one hand, have amazing creative energies for making war or for being inventive or for being courageous in various, it really is young men who are the great innovators in societies. Absolutely. They're like a precious, precious resource. You have to direct them in the right direction in order to be maximally socially productive, because they're also very dangerous. They're also, they wage war, they rape, they're a very kind of volatile group of people in any society. And what you do about them is a big question. So maybe you conscript them into armies, maybe you put them in boarding schools and kind of try and make them play as much sport as possible. I don't know, like there are various things that you can do to try and like control them. I guess what we do by default is we give them porn and video games and hope for the best and tell them that they suck like that. I mean, that's another thing that contemporary society does, is like to constantly insult young men, which seems to me like a bad idea, honestly. But I mean, we face these eternal problems. There's this museum in Oxford called the Pitt Rivers Museum. It's an anthropology museum, and it's my favourite museum in the world. It's very strange to visit because it's very old-fashioned, and it has tiny little handwritten notes describing things and stuff. It hasn't really changed substantially since the Victorian period when it was created. But the one thing it does, which is different from other anthropology museums, and I think really good, is it groups artifacts by theme rather than by region or time period. So you have a cabinet which is devoted to like bows and arrows from all different times and places, and then you have a cabinet that's devoted to hair grooming tools from all times and places and whatever. And what's really good about it is that you're forced to see how similar the items are. And it makes you realize that there are really only so many ways of solving that problem. There are only so many ways of combing your hair, right? And everyone kind of ends up gravitating towards just these handful of solutions. And I think the same is true of human sexuality. And I think that the mistake that progressives often make is to think that we are completely distinct from everyone who has lived before us. And in fact, that our ancestors, it's like the opposite of ancestor worship, which is a common practice across cultures. It's like ancestor condemnation. It's like they must be wrong. They must be bad. We are uniquely enlightened about the nature of human sexuality. And that just doesn't seem very likely to me.
One idea from the past that I thought was interesting is, sexual repression has one of the worst associations in our culture. It's like dangerous almost even for anybody to approach a sexual life. Yeah. But with your work, you kind of complicate that story a little bit. So what do we usually mean when we say sexual repression, and what gets lost when we treat all restraint as the same thing?
So it's worth saying that we do demand sexual repression still sometimes. And we do have laws around sexuality that don't just abide by the consent principle. So, for instance, we criminalize necrophilia and we criminalize bestiality. And those things are socially unacceptable. Even though trying to express that in terms of consent is not that difficult.
Yeah.
It's legal to kill and eat animals, but it's not legal to have sex with them. It's like, it is a bit odd. But so there are limits still, even in the society, which is very unrestricted. Because you need to have a degree of restriction. You just do. I mean, because if everyone just acted on their sexual impulses all the time, people have conflicting sexual impulses, like obviously. And so you need to learn how to regulate it. And that doesn't mean being celibate for life or, although obviously some people might choose to do that for various reasons. But it means recognizing that it can be healthy and normal and good to have to regulate your own sexual appetites, which I think actually most people do think that. It's kind of a rhetorical thing to be so allergic to the idea of sexual repression. In practice, actually, most people do that already and believe that that's a good thing already.
How would you distinguish between something that's maybe unhealthy repression and healthy restraint?
I mean, I can come up with loads of instances of when you should absolutely, like, if you fancy your brother's wife, you should keep that to yourself. An example among many. It's just it's obviously a bad thing to act on those kind of impulses, even if they're completely understandable. You need to repress that in that moment. I mean, and again, I think that everyone is actually on board with that, really. That, as with so many of the ideas from the sexual liberation narrative, there's a lot of internal contradictions. And often, actually, when people are faced with the most extreme version or the clearest version of a principle being acted upon, they find it repulsive, because I think that as an ideology, it doesn't map very well onto moral instincts.
One idea that's captivating that I've heard recently is that, like, for women, restraint can function as like a source of power. So essentially, the thing that they've been told or sold that they would get from having carefree casual sex, that they could actually get from restraint, and it protects them from men who have no interest in their well-being. And that particularly applies to the women on the dating scene who just feel like they are falling prey to it.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not like, oh, I want to have sex with men, but it's just like, this is the way that it is, and I just have to subscribe to it. And so restraining could be a source of power. Does that resonate in any way from what you've seen?
Have you heard this expression, boy sober? So women online will talk about going boy sober, which kind of means what you're describing. So having had a period of throwing oneself into sexual relationships and being burned, women will kind of swear off doing that and will deliberately restrain themselves and go boy sober, which is quite interesting. I think what's kind of unfortunate though is how often, like, I think part of the explanation for why mainstream culture among women, particularly online, can be very negative about men is partly because women don't really have, when we have smaller families and fewer siblings and more absent fathers and so on, women are less likely to have positive non-sexual relationships with men in their lives. They're less likely to have a brother or a father that they're close to, because that's the nature of how families have changed in recent decades. So they don't have these kind of positive associations with men. Mm-hmm. Combined with having bad hookups, situationships, etc., can make women feel really bitter. Like, one of the really interesting things about marriage is that men and women tend to politically converge with their spouses. The longer that you're married to someone, the more alike you become in terms of your political beliefs. And I think the converse is true as well, that the longer that you're single, or like functionally single, you might be having hookups or whatever, but you're not actually in a relationship with someone, the more likely you are to diverge from the opposite sex. And that is something that we see a lot in the data across loads of countries, that women and men are increasingly dissimilar in terms of their politics and have a quite an adversarial attitude towards the opposite sex, which obviously isn't conducive to them forming relationships. I mean, you end up with a vicious cycle, I think. So I mean, the boy sober thing, it's describing something true and it's quite funny, but there's a wider and quite dismaying context of like people, there's real dysfunction within dating.
What do you think changes about the environment if women kind of raise the bar on, I mean, we talked about like consent as like the baseline environment, but what do you think changes about the environment if women decide to raise the standard for themselves?
So, interestingly, on college campuses, which are a relatively closed environment, on college campuses where there are more men than women, so women are the rare resource, sexual norms tend to be more towards the feminine preference, so more monogamous and less hooking up. On college campuses where there are an excess of women and the men are the scarce resource, they skew towards less monogamy and more hookups. So when they feel as if they have power within the system, women will demand that men conform more to the female norm when it comes to sexuality. It's kind of a coordination problem though, right? Because even though I think women in general would benefit from everyone kind of getting together and being more assertive and insisting upon this standard, it's a difficult thing to do as an individual. I mean, you can, it would just mean, and I sort of think like if a man will not pursue a relationship with you because you want to delay having sex, then there's a good chance it wouldn't have been a good relationship anyway. So like maybe the loss isn't that bad. But it is true that if you decide to be really eccentric, if you decide to have really trad kind of dating norms, you will limit the pool of people who want to be with you, and you'll suffer for it socially, and people might think you're weird. So I don't want to trivialize how difficult that is, and that's obviously part of what's generating this culture to begin with.
Yeah.
Like people conform to the norm for a reason because that seems to be the most advantageous thing for them to do because it's a coordination issue. But my honest advice, obviously, for young women is to reject hookup culture. And for some people that would be easier than for other people. But like the downsides are pretty grievous and the risks are pretty grievous. So I think at an individual level, it's worth suffering the social costs.
Especially you're talking about the fact of women being agreeable. I think it's really, on that front, it's like at some level, like feeling that they're committing social suicide, where you kind of lose all your dating leverage. And then I guess the fear underneath all of that being like, if I don't play along, I'm going to be alone. All of those things just feel very, very real. How would you help women deal with those realities?
It's probably the most common question I get is something like, I want to get married. I want to like do the sort of small C conservative thing. Like, how do I find someone? I met my husband through university, like very conventional. I've been with him since I was 21. So I've had a very like last helicopter out of Saigon kind of experience, I think. It's very easy to criticize the apps. But for a lot of people, they feel like, well, how else am I going to meet someone except on the apps? Because everyone else is on the apps.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's difficult. I wish I had a good answer. I don't really. I mean, I could say, so I think one thing that people could do is be less shy about asking for help. Because one of the things that we've learned about how matchmaking happens is that people struggle to do it spontaneously. And when they don't have a infrastructure in place to try and facilitate matchmaking, they will end up just not doing it, right? And people will just drift into being unmarried forever. Or some people will. Some people will manage to make it work, but they're kind of the lucky ones. It's more common for people to actually respond by being quite passive. and people feel like embarrassed and as if they ought to be able to do it completely on their own without anyone helping them. I think that that's understandable but wrong. I think that if you're struggling to find someone, you need to ask your friends to help you out. Even ask your relatives to help you out, like horrible, right? But what happens in traditional cultures often is the aunties, it's like the older women who'll be like, I know someone, so-and-so's son is unmarried and so-and-so's daughter is unmarried. Why don't we invite them to the same party or whatever and see what happens? Like, there's all sorts of scheming that goes on, which is actually, people complain about it, but like it quite often works.
It's probably a positive thing.
Yeah, right. And certainly, I mean, I constantly have friends asking me if I can find them a partner. Because I keep going around saying this publicly. You should ask for help, and then people ask me for help. And I've had some modest success, but you should. I don't think there should be anything embarrassing about just saying like, put the word out.
One of the things, I mean, is like we talked about the fact that men and women are different, and then so the behavior that women encounter on the dating scene, and having to sort through that, right? So there's just like this underlying biological difference, but then you have all this behavior around ghosting, sexual pressure, emotional disregard, feeling used. So how do you draw a line between, okay, we're different, and then men just choosing to treat you like crap?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be like policing of bad male behavior. Yeah, so what some cultures would do, I suppose, is they would say, yeah, great, like men can just do whatever they want all the time. And although I can't really, like every culture has a concept of rape, for instance. What's more common, I mean, Susan Brown-Miller points this out in Against Our Will, but what typically you see in most cultures is that rape is quite defined in quite a limited way. So there are certain women who you mustn't rape, and then there are certain women that you're legally allowed to rape, basically. Like low status women or slaves or women who don't have anyone looking out for them. Whereas what we aspire to in contemporary society and what feminists agitate for is an equality among women, which says that actually a rape of any woman is just as bad as a rape of any other, which is, I think, a really important feminist principle. And not all cultures have that, to put it mildly. But I think which I think tells us that there are always efforts at regulating male sexuality. The question is to what standard, I guess. And our culture tries to do that. I mean, Me Too was an attempt to do that. Like, Me Too was not wrong at all, in the sense that like what was being identified during Me Too was a culture of terrible male sexual behavior, particularly by men who had gatekeeping roles within high status industries like Hollywood. And that was all completely true. But the question is, what do you do about it? Because unfortunately, the key Me Too strategy, which is basically attempting social shaming, it works in a limited kind of way. Like Harvey Weinstein did go to prison, but it doesn't seem to have, I mean, to the extent that it seems to have had any macro effects, it's maybe making the good guys more hesitant to ask women out, which isn't a great outcome. I don't think the bad guys have become especially kinder or more sensitive, as far as I can tell. It seems that the same kind of stuff is still going on, because this basic dynamic where if you're a Hollywood producer or whatever, if you have some kind of important job, you can offer advancement in return for sexual favors. Like, as long as that prevails as a system, it's difficult to prevent bad actors from abusing it. So, yeah, I mean, I think honestly the answer to the painful answer to the problems presented by Me Too is to have a generally more conservative sexual culture, because a culture of casual sex is very, very easy for bad actors to manipulate. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned marriage before, and so what do you feel like that environment provides that is beneficial? I mean, what marriage is in like a really basic way is it's a socially and legally recognized relationship originally conceived for the purposes of having and raising children. So it's like a unit of social organization that has legitimacy and is public. And some of the benefits of that include the people in your life, your family, your friends, will pay very close attention to who you propose to choose as a spouse. You know, like there's a certain threshold that you're supposed to reach in order to be a marriageable person, and particularly in a society where premarital sex is forbidden, men will work really hard to reach that standard to be marriageable, because it's the only way that you can have sex legitimately. So it kind of forces people to conform to social expectations about how you ought to behave. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I don't like people writing their own vows, this makes me sound really like cranky, but is that when you go to a traditional wedding service, the bride and the groom say the same vows that you said if you yourself got married in that way. And so, you know, I said those vows 9 years ago, and it means that whenever I go to a wedding, which has I sit there and I think, my husband sits there and I think, oh, we said that. It's like it's a constant refreshing of like what exactly it is that you've committed to publicly, and that everyone else in the same institution has committed to publicly. And there's in terms of trying to channel people towards behaving in pro-social ways, there's a pretty good way of doing it. There's a reason this stuff has persisted for as long as it has. And yes, that has never, you know, there is so much darkness within that institution.
Of marriage.
Yeah, of course there is. There's domestic abuse, there's infidelity, there's everything. Like, you know, again, it's a Christian institution and Christians have a thing or two to say about sin. This is what people are like. That doesn't mean, though, that you have to abandon the whole institution, because unfortunately it is the nature of humans to behave like this. And we haven't yet found a workable alternative, really, to... I mean, if you're not going to have children, I think marriage is take it or leave it. It's a party, that's fine. But if you are having children, then I think there's a reason that this is the most stable setting within which to do that. And it kind of... It offers a template for how one ought to behave that works better than any other template we've yet discovered for producing the outcomes we want.
Kind of to your point of how a lot of women don't have good examples of healthy men in their life, they don't have a father or brother or whatever. I think the same thing with marriage at some level, which is that a lot of people don't have good examples of like a really healthy marriage to look towards. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist, or that like that actual container wouldn't produce a beneficial result for them, or that there's something wrong with the container itself. It's just that we haven't been exposed to healthy examples. And I think whether you have kids or you don't have kids, I think the idea of, you know, life is hard, and having this like one person that you're like in it with, like emotionally, spiritually, physically, and you're going to weather the storm together, and you're going to be committed, and you're committed to that person's well-being on every single level.
Yeah. In sickness and in health. Yeah, the whole thing. Yeah,
it creates like a very safe environment to express your sexuality. And it's just really hard. I mean, I think there's no way of going about this conversation that is going to provide like easy answers for people of like, oh, just do this, and then your life is gonna like everything is messy. But what messy solution is actually going to produce sustained like well-being is really the question, I guess.
It's a fundamental asymmetry as well, just within political debate, in that the progressive, or not even progressive necessarily, but like utopians have a rhetorical advantage on their side because they don't have to defend an existing system. They can propose a future ideal system, and they don't have to defend any of the trade-offs because the system doesn't exist, so there aren't any trade-offs. Whereas what someone even mildly conservative has to do is say, for instance, on marriage, like, I know about domestic abuse. I know about adultery. I know that there are downsides to marriage. I still think that marriage is the best system that we actually have. And that's a weak basis on which to argue. It also happens to be true. I mean, because the problem with the utopian argument is that utopia doesn't exist, it never will. Like, we have to actually look across, it's this anthropological point again, you have to actually look across the sweep of human history and see what real options are available to us in terms of social organising and choose from them. You can't just cook up some idealised version, because normally when people try and do that, it just results in horror and disaster. Utopians have a very bad record on this.
The thing about marriage that's interesting is, like, if you go way back to like 2,000 years ago, right? I think what's interesting is that basically you had a lot of people that are getting married when they were like 16 or 18, maybe even like 100 years ago. I don't know what the average age was. Maybe it was 20.
There's a whole controversial question here. It's really interesting.
So basically, if people are thinking about not having sex before marriage as a kind of binary rule of not doing that, what that would actually require is like some men and women would be 35 and like never having sex, versus living in a culture where it's assumed that you're going to get married earlier and you're going to have sexual experiences. And so how would you think about that in terms of like the container being healthy but messy if done in the right way, but also that the age in which you're going to enter into that container is just way later. So is it realistic to?
Or people get married younger. If people are getting married younger, then, and that does vary across time. So like in England, for instance, I'm more familiar with the history. It was pretty common for people to get married in their early to mid-20s as standard in the period of before the sexual revolution, very consistently, including women. So you didn't generally have child brides in that kind of culture. And indeed, I mean, up until, I think even in the 1980s in America, the average marriage age for women was like 25. It's surprisingly young, surprisingly recently when people are getting married. If you're getting married, even in your early 20s, you're still pretty stupid. And you do still need, I think, a lot of input from the people who know you best and the people who aren't blinded by horniness and hormones.
Yeah, because that's the pushback, that people are not emotionally mature.
Right, but that's why you don't just leave it up to the individual. I mean, that doesn't mean having arranged marriages where people have no say.
Yeah.
It means having community input in terms of who's appropriate, who isn't, who do we want to be putting, which people do we want to be introducing to one another, you know. There's a whole dance, like literally a dance often. Like you read Jane Austen novels or whatever, we have these big community dances, which are, you know, very restrained, right? Like very limited touching, it's all very formal, whatever, but like incredible levels of sexual tension.
Yeah.
Which is of course that's why Bridgerton and so on is so popular. Like, and it's interesting actually that still modern women have this longing for that kind of formalized system of sexual tension. And what you're not supposed to do in that kind of culture is to abandon the community input and run off to Gretna Green and get married illicitly, which of course does sometimes happen in Jane Austen novels, because the community input has a purpose in terms of not letting you hitch your life to someone who's bad for you. Mm-hmm. But also, I mean, the other thing you do also have to do in that kind of culture is have lower expectations for marriage. So you don't have lower expectations in terms of the really important things, like having an economic union and having a co-parenting union. But I think the expectations we have now, there's this great book by Eli Finkel called The All or Nothing Marriage, which is about the way that marriage expectations have changed over time. And he describes our current attitude towards marriage as the all or nothing marriage. So either your marriage is like perfect in every way. So it's not just an economic and a parenting union, but it's also a you have perfect sexual compatibility and you have fantastic conversations and shared interests and, you're like real soulmates kind of relationship. Either you have marriages like that or you bail. Like if any problem emerges in your marriage, you just get rid, get divorced. And that is often the expectation around marriage now, which again is very historically unusual. I think most people in the past would have certainly aspired to a fundamental level of compatibility, but they would have expected, say, their conversational, their most important conversation partners, the people that they hang out with to have fun, were much more likely to be people of the same sex as themselves, maybe kin or friends or whatever, but people lived generally much more socially segregated lives in that sense. And then the purpose of the spouse was a bit different.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to, if you're going to have a culture where people don't have sex before marriage, then other things have to be in place.
Well, you've certainly brought up a lot of riveting ideas. I think a lot of points that you raised, I think, are really important. And when I read the reviews around your book, it was like, I mean, just across ideological differences, there was just so many people that loved the nuance that you brought to the conversation. And I love how you don't make it sound easy, but you're painting a vision here that accounts for it being a mixed bag. And I think that that's really important for people. I'm curious, like, as the last question, where do you feel like this conversation is going? Like the next 5, 10, 15 years, where do you think the sexual culture is heading based on everything that you've seen?
Well, I think something that's impossible to miss about political culture right now is polarization. And you can find, like, I'm a real centrist, right? I really am. Like sometimes people on the left tend to peg me as being on the right only because they don't really understand the right. They don't know how far it goes, and they also don't know how much diversity there is in the right. And I say, no, like, I am a centrist. Like we have a political discourse now where you can have one online subculture which is arguing that every woman needs to have 10 children, right? And never work.
Be a trad wife, yeah.
Yeah, like really full throttle. And then on the other side, you have everything you can imagine in terms of sexual experimentation, liberation. And I guess I'm trying to forge something in the middle, but it is sort of the nature of the internet to encourage that spiraling outwards, and unfortunately gender polarization as well, in terms of people not coupling up and not de-radicalizing each other. I think men and women tend to de-radicalize each other if given enough intimate contact. I mean, I'm very much hoping that changes, but people need a log off in order for that to happen. And I actually think that probably will happen. I think increasingly there's a feeling that the internet makes us sick. And if you have a lot of self-mastery, and if you want to be in control of your own life, if you want to be agentic, you have to resist your own, the worst online impulses that you find, and you have to work very hard to live offline as much as you can. I mean, I say this, I make a living on the internet, so do you. But touching grass is the idiom, right? And I actually think that increasingly that's going to become more and more aspirational, and people are going to try harder and harder to be as offline as they can. And so maybe that'll do good things for social politics.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Appreciate the conversation.